When you picture Viking warriors, what comes to mind? Bearded raiders, axe-wielding berserkers, long ships crashing onto foreign shores like thunder. And when Hollywood shows their defenses, you get a few spiked fences, maybe some torches, mud, tents, and chaos. But history tells a different story. The real Vikings, the warlords, kings, and warrior chieftains, didn't just fight. They built. And what they built was terrifyingly effective. From nothing but dirt, stone, timber, and willpower, Viking warriors forged military fortresses so clever, so well-positioned, and so hard to breach that some of them still stand today. Not as ruins, but as mysteries. Massive ring-shaped forts with mathematical precision, barricades aligned with solstices and enemy approaches, ports that vanished into fog, guarded by traps, walls layered like armor, trenches that drowned the reckless. They didn't just raid kingdoms, they defended their own with walls worthy of empires. And they did it fast. No bulldozers, no cement, no blueprints. Just bare hands, belief in the gods, and battle-hardened logic. This is the brutal brilliance of Viking fortress design. A side of Viking warfare Hollywood won't show you because it doesn't look savage, it looks smart. Part 1. Fortress Born of Fire. The Rise of the Viking Defensive Mindset. The first Viking fortresses didn't rise from peace. They were born from blood. You see, the early Viking Age, roughly late 700s to 900 CE, was chaotic even by Norse standards. Clans fought clans, chieftains turned on each other, villages burned, power was fragile. If you were a warlord, you couldn't just win battles. You had to hold the land you took. So from the smoldering ruins of early raids came a shift in Viking strategy. A realization, if we're to become more than raiders, we need strongholds. And that's when the Norse turned to engineering. Beyond raiding, why Vikings had to build fortresses. For all their fame as sea raiders, Vikings were settlers too. Once they took land, whether in Scandinavia, Britain, or even Russia, they had to protect it. But Viking warriors didn't have massive labor forces like the Romans. No concrete, no cranes, no bureaucracy. So they built with what they had. Wood, earth, sweat, and they built fast, because an undefended base meant death. The result? Some of the most innovative military architecture Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. The Ring Fort, a Viking masterpiece. The most famous example? The Trelleborgs, perfectly circular Viking forts found in Denmark and Sweden. Named after the site of Trelleborg, these structures were mathematical marvels. Built around 980 CE, possibly by King Harald Bluetooth. Giant earth ramparts forming perfect circles, some over 140 meters wide. Gates placed at cardinal directions. Divided into 4 symmetrical quadrants, each with its own longhouses. Surrounded by ditches, wooden palisades, and defensive berms. Paths inside aligned like a cross, optimized for movement and defense. Let's be clear, this wasn't a let's wing it kind of build. This was strategic precision. Archaeologists believe these forts could be constructed in months, not years, possibly due to massive coordinated labor from Viking loyalists or subjects. And they weren't ceremonial, they were garrisons, built to house warriors, store supplies, and defend territory. Location, location, and blood. Viking forts weren't just well built, they were perfectly placed. Strategically near rivers, coastlines, or trade routes, where visibility was high and ambush unlikely. Many were built on elevated land to give sightlines an advantage in battle, and the surrounding terrain was always used. Marshes to slow cavalry, forests to mask traps, trenches filled with sharpened stakes, waterways redirected to act as moats. This wasn't brute force, it was military intelligence honed through decades of survival. The defensive mindset, fortify first, feast later. Unlike some medieval cultures that built castles for status, Viking fortresses were pragmatic. They didn't flaunt wealth, they didn't house royalty, they weren't even permanent. They were tools, built quickly, modified constantly, abandoned when outlived, rebuilt somewhere else, better, stronger, meaner. And this mindset, fortify first, feast later, was what kept Viking armies alive in hostile territory. Whether in Ireland, the Slavic lands, or Francia, the Norse adapted, built fast, and held ground. The warrior builder, why every fighter was also a laborer. In Viking armies, warriors didn't just fight. They dug, hauled, chopped, lashed logs, shaped earth. Every man was expected to build. Because if you didn't, you wouldn't survive the winter. These were warrior engineers long before the term existed. It's part of why Viking raids were so effective. They could attack, and fortify a beachhead in a matter of days, which meant their enemies, often slower, scattered, or overly reliant on castles, couldn't dislodge them easily. Legends and legacy, how these forts shaped a culture. Some Trelleborgs were abandoned within decades, others evolved into towns or trade centers. But their cultural impact endured. They weren't just forts, they were statements. That the Vikings weren't just pirates, they were planners, builders, defenders, capable of creating civilization, not just destroying it. From dirt, they made defense. From blood, they made boundaries. From chaos, they built command. And this was just the beginning. Part 2. Inside the Walls. What life was really like in a Viking fortress. You've passed through the gate. The ramparts rise behind you. Spears gleam. The air is heavy with smoke and sweat. Welcome to the Viking fortress. Not just a wall of defense, but a beating heart of Norse military life. No room for comfort. Every inch had a purpose. Inside the walls, space was precious. At Trelleborg and other circular forts, the layout was methodical. Longhouses were arranged in 4 quadrants. Each longhouse stretched up to 30 meters long, divided by streets laid in perfect cross-shaped grids, built low to the ground with turf roofs and timber beams. Interiors were dark, smoky, and practical. These weren't cozy homes. They were barracks, designed for warriors, storage, smithing, and strategy. The walls may have kept enemies out, but inside, life was brutal. Living conditions, smoke, sweat, and steel. Step inside a Viking longhouse and the first thing you notice is the smoke. There's a central fire pit, but no chimney. The smoke lingers, curling around the beams, seeping into the wood, into your clothes, into your lungs. Beds, straw mats, or fur-covered planks. Light, only fire and slivers of daylight through smoke holes. Smell, sweat, iron, stew, wet wool. You slept shoulder to shoulder with warriors and craftsmen. You sharpened blades by lamplight. You listened for war horns in the night. Rest was survival, not comfort. The warrior routine more than fighting. Life inside a Viking fortress followed strict rhythms, part military, part survivalist. Morning drills, training with axe, spear, and shield. Guard rotations, patrolling ramparts and gatehouses. Craftsmen at work, blacksmiths reforging blades, fletchers making arrows. Hunting parties foraging for meat, herbs, and timber beyond the walls. Religious rites, offerings made to Odin, Thor, and Tyr for protection, victory, and justice. And every evening, strategic councils. Mead shared. Oaths sworn by firelight. This wasn't just a home, it was a war machine at rest. Weapons production forged on site. Viking fortresses didn't just store weapons, they produced them. Inside the longhouses or nearby workshops, blacksmiths worked with bog iron, a natural resource from Scandinavian wetlands. They forged spearheads, axe blades, seax knives, arrowheads, chainmail rings, and even iron fittings for siege equipment. Every warrior maintained their own gear, and if a blade failed in battle, the shame could follow you into Valhalla. Food and feasting, sustaining the garrison. Feeding a fortress wasn't easy. Most Viking strongholds weren't surrounded by lush farmland. They were placed for strategic defense, not agriculture. So food came from fishing expeditions on nearby rivers. Preserved meats, salted pork, smoked fish. Hard bread made from rye or barley. Porridge thick with grains, dried fruit, or lard. Mead and ale brewed in barrels beneath the floorboards. But there were feasts too, when raiding parties returned successful or gods were to be honored. Then the fortress echoed with song. Bones cracked, horns raised, and warriors swore loyalty anew. Law and order, justice behind the walls. Despite the brutality, Viking fortresses had laws. Inside, discipline was strict. Theft from another warrior, punishable by public flogging or exile. Cowardice in battle, you could be stripped of your weapons, a fate worse than death. Every fortress had its own law speaker, a man who memorized hundreds of laws and passed judgment aloud before the men and the gods. Even the gods had their place in justice. Runes were cast, oaths sworn. Sometimes trials involved combat. The fortress wasn't just a shield. It was a court, a tribe, a system. Women and children, rare but present. Though most Viking fortresses were male-dominated war camps, women were not absent. Some women traveled with war bands, healers, cooks, or shield maidens. In longer settled areas, entire families lived inside or just beyond the ramparts. Children were raised early into fortress life, trained in woodcraft, wrestling, and weapon care. By age 12, a boy might already be joining the outer patrols. These weren't playgrounds. They were forges, shaping the next generation of survivors. Religion and ritual, the sacred inside the stronghold. Viking forts weren't just military zones, they were spiritual. Every stronghold had sacred spaces, even simple ones. A god post carved with the face of Thor or Odin. A ring of stones for sacrifices. Bones hung over doors for protection. Runestones placed at gates to call on ancestors. Sacrifices were real, sometimes animal, occasionally human. During times of siege or loss, warriors might offer blood to the gods, seeking strength, luck, or vengeance. Even the layout of some forts aligned with sunrises on solstices, echoing deep beliefs in time, fate, and divine will. What it meant to live inside. Inside a Viking fortress, you didn't just live, you belonged. Every morning was survival, every meal earned, every night uncertain. But behind the walls, you were part of something ancient, something unbreakable. Not just a raider, not just a warrior, a keeper of the stronghold. Part 3. Enemies at the Gate. How Vikings repelled sieges with brutal tactics. The fortress is quiet. Too quiet. Then, a horn blast rips the silence. Shadows on the horizon, shields lifted, enemies approaching. The age of Viking warfare was not just about raids. It was about holding the line, defending your land, your people, and your gods. And when the enemy came knocking, the Vikings did not hide. They turned their fortresses into death traps. Siege warfare in the Viking Age? Siege tactics in the Viking Age were rare, but when they happened, they were savage. Most Norse armies avoided drawn-out battles behind walls. They preferred mobility. But when a rival clan, a foreign army, or a treacherous king brought the fight to a Viking stronghold, the defenders were more than ready. At places like Fyrkat and Aggersborg, ring fortresses weren't just built to endure, they were designed to kill invaders. Imagine this. You charge at the walls, only to find yourself funneled into a narrow gate. From above, arrows rain down. Boiling water or pitch may follow. Warriors await behind a kill gate where escape is nearly impossible. The kill zone, engineered for ambush. Viking engineers knew how to shape the battlefield to their advantage. Entryways were not straight. They were curved, angled, or staggered to slow down enemies and expose their flanks. These kill zones were the Viking equivalent of trench warfare, bottlenecks where defenders could strike with lethal precision. Behind the gates, archers stood atop the inner ramparts. Spearmen crouched behind low palisades. Slings and throwing axes hurled from behind cover. Spiked pits hidden beneath straw or snow. Even trap tunnels leading nowhere but death. If you made it through the gate, you earned your doom. Psychological warfare, fear as a weapon. Vikings didn't just fight with steel, they fought with fear. Outside their fortresses, they left. Skulls on spikes. Burned effigies of enemy gods. Runes carved with curses. Animal blood splashed across enemy banners. These were not mere decorations, they were psychological tools. To a superstitious raider or Christian soldier, this could shatter morale. They believed the Vikings had dark powers, that the gods themselves guarded these walls. Many attackers turned back before a single axe was swung. Counterattack, the fury within. When defense wasn't enough, Viking fortresses unleashed counterattacks with brutal coordination. Hidden doors behind the walls allowed flanking maneuvers. Secret earth tunnels led behind enemy lines. Mounted warriors could burst from the back gate, cutting off retreat. Once the enemy was inside, the defenders didn't panic. They herded them. Warriors fought in small teams using circular shield formations in tight spaces, isolating and picking off invaders one by one. And if all else failed, they collapsed sections of the wall to crush the enemy with earth and timber. Intelligence and spies, knowing when they'd strike. The best Viking defense started before the battle. Fortresses often had early warning systems. Watchmen stationed miles out on ridgelines. Signal fires on nearby hills. Carrier ravens trained to fly between strongholds. Intelligence was gathered from spies, merchants, and even bards who traveled between clans. If word reached the fortress of an incoming threat, the gates were sealed, women and children hidden, and warriors took their posts long before the enemy arrived. If the walls fell, no surrender. In rare moments when Viking walls were breached, the defenders didn't run. They made last stands worthy of legend. Women would arm themselves. Elders would cast curses and hurl stones. The injured would fight to the last breath. Some strongholds were burned by their own people, rather than let them fall into enemy hands. There was no word for surrender in Old Norse that meant safety. To die defending your fortress was not only honorable, it was the only option. Holding the line, a culture of resistance. In the Viking mind, a fortress wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. We are here, we are unbroken, we will not be moved. It was not built from stone, it was built from will. And if you dared to challenge that, you would leave your bones in the dirt outside its gates. Part 4. Earth, Wood, and Will. The secret materials behind Viking fortress strength. We often imagine fortresses as stone giants, cold, hard, and immovable. But the Vikings didn't have the quarries of Rome. They didn't use marble, concrete, or steel. And yet, they built defenses that withstood the test of time and war. How? With earth, with timber, with cunning. What modern engineers might dismiss as primitive was, in truth, a masterpiece of regional genius. Wood that withstood time and siege. Let's start with wood, the lifeblood of the Norse world. Viking fortresses weren't just slapped together with whatever trees were nearby. They strategically selected oak for structural posts, dense, strong, resistant to rot, pine for its flexibility and resin-rich properties, birch for lighter framework and bark insulation. They dried timbers in advance to reduce warping. Some logs were charred intentionally on the outside, a forgotten technique that preserved wood by sealing it against insects and moisture. These weren't fences, these were walls of trees turned to armor. And they didn't just stack logs, they locked them together in notched crossbeams, woven frameworks, and dovetail joints. No nails, no metal, just pressure, shape, and skill. The magic of earth walls. Next came the earth. Viking ramparts weren't solid dirt piles, they were layered and engineered. Gravel bases for drainage, compacted clay layers for strength, topsoil and sod to grow grass, anchoring the walls against erosion. They didn't just raise the ground, they made living walls. Thick, heavy, absorbing shock and flame. These ramparts could be 12 to 15 feet high, wide enough at the top to walk across or mount defenses. And because they blended into the landscape, they were nearly invisible from a distance. Inside the walls, defensive genius. Behind the outer defenses, Viking fortresses held internal zones of control, cross-ditches to block cavalry, raised platforms for archers, watchtowers at each compass point, guardhouses with layered exits to trap infiltrators. Some fortresses even had inner fortifications, a kind of fallback citadel where final stands could be made. And all of this, remember, was made without blueprints, just tradition, generations of skill, and an unbreakable will to survive. Built for the weather, too. The Vikings didn't just defend against enemies, they defended against nature, cold winds, heavy snow, spring floods. These weren't inconveniences, they were threats. Viking fortresses were built with sloped drainage ditches to keep floodwaters out, elevated buildings to avoid rot and frost, insulated walls with moss and turf, sun-facing entrances to reduce snow buildup. Even the pathways were designed to prevent ice formation, lined with gravel and covered in bark or straw in winter months. This wasn't brute force, this was climate-smart design, spiritual protection beyond the physical. To a Viking, the strength of a fortress wasn't just in logs and earth, it was in luck, in blessing, in fate. That's why key support beams were sometimes carved with runes, not decorative but protective. Some foundations were laid with offerings beneath them, animal bones, iron knives, small human effigies, even in rare cases, sacrifices. These weren't for show, they were part of a deeply held belief that a place could be spiritually fortified, that it could resist not just weapons, but misfortune. To live behind a cursed wall was to invite death, but to live behind a blessed one, that was to sleep in the arms of the gods. Tools of the trade, simple but lethal efficiency. It's easy to forget, all of this was built without modern tools. Vikings used broad axes for felling and shaping timber, adzes for smoothing beams, iron augers for boring holes, measuring rods based on body parts, elbows, hands, strides, and yet their alignments were often perfectly symmetrical. Fortresses like Trelleborg are laid out with such precision that even modern archaeologists marvel at the math. This was no guesswork. It was geometry, passed down not through textbooks, but through blood and memory. From nothing to unbreakable. So how did the Vikings build impenetrable fortresses? From nothing. They didn't wait for materials. They used what the land gave them. They didn't rely on plans. They trusted ancestral wisdom. They didn't just build shelters. They created symbols of resistance, bold, brutal statements that said, "You may come with fire, you may come with steel, but you will not pass these walls." Part 5. What really happened inside a Viking fortress? From the outside, a Viking fortress looked like a war machine, but inside it was something else entirely. A living, breathing organism, pulsing with politics, family, loyalty, and danger. It wasn't just a place to hide from enemies, it was a command center, a sanctuary, a marketplace, a battleground for power, and sometimes all of these in a single day. Power at the core, the Lord's Hall. At the center of most Viking fortresses stood the Chieftains' Hall. Not a palace, but not just a house either. It was built bigger than the rest, sometimes double or triple the size of an average longhouse. Thick-timbered, high-roofed, smoky, lit by central hearths, it was the heartbeat of the fortress. From here, the jarls or local leaders would hold court, resolve disputes, give out land and treasure, command warriors, plan raids and diplomacy. It was where alliances were made and betrayals whispered. Every meal, every toast, every glance meant something. And sitting too close to the jarl, or too far, could change your fate. Warrior barracks, brotherhood and brutality. Viking fortresses often had designated areas for warriors, and they weren't glamorous. Straw bedding, animal skin coverings, tools and weapons stacked along the walls. The smell of sweat and iron thick in the air. These were not mercenaries lounging in luxury. They were warriors ready to fight at a moment's notice, men who lived by the blade and could die in their sleep. Training yards were built inside the walls, dueling pits, sparring circles, shield walls were drilled over and over even in winter. Brotherhood was everything, but so was dominance, and rivalry between fighters could explode violently, even fatally, behind closed gates. Feasts, faith, and the role of women. Fortresses weren't just for fighting, they were centers of ritual and life. During festivals, like Yule or Blotz, the inner courtyard transformed. Long tables were set out for feasting. Sacrificial animals were brought in, honored, then slain. Mead horns passed from hand to hand. And the skalds, Viking poets, recited tales of gods and ancestors. Women in these spaces weren't idle. Many were weavers, healers, priestesses, or managers of food stores. Some wielded immense spiritual authority, conducting rituals that even warriors feared. The fortress wasn't just male muscle, it was family, religion, and community. Fire and famine, when fortresses turned into prisons. Not every Viking fortress stood in glory. Some endured sieges, days or even weeks where the outside world became an enemy wall. In these times, fires were tightly rationed. Food stores were locked and guarded. Rainwater was caught and boiled. People burned manure and moss for fuel. And when things grew desperate, livestock were slaughtered early. Dogs, horses, rats, sometimes even worse. A fortress that protected you could also trap you. And it wasn't always the invaders who posed the greatest threat. It was the starving warriors next to you, the jealous kin, the man who used to be your ally. The cold reality, life behind the walls was still hard. Let's be clear, Viking fortresses weren't castles of comfort. Winters inside were still bitter. Disease still spread. Food still ran out. Walls still cracked. And if a fire broke out in the wooden buildings, it could bring down half the stronghold in a night. The difference was, Viking warriors endured it, because the fortress was not a luxury. It was a symbol of strength, of unity, of domination. To lose one was to lose your name, your legacy, and sometimes your life. Legacy, the fortresses that still speak. Many Viking fortresses are gone now, swallowed by earth, plowed by farmers, or lost to time. But some, like Trelleborg or Aggersborg, remain. Their perfect circles, their earthen walls, their timber outlines dug into the dirt like scars of ancient strength. Archaeologists still marvel at them. Military historians still learn from them. And for those who walk their grounds today, there's still something in the air. A chill, a silence, a pressure. As if the earth itself remembers the war cries, the oaths, and the blood once spilled behind those walls. Viking fortresses weren't built with riches. They were built with necessity. With mud on the hands, blood on the axe, and stone in the heart. And even now, 1,000 years later, they still stand.